All right, I'm listening.
The second parak is Ketz Megula, the revelation of the end. The first part is Simonei HaKetz Megula. What are the signs that tell us that the end is coming? In the previous chapter, we learned that the appearance of redemption is a slow process that comes in stages. In this chapter, we will attempt to see how we can identify the beginning of this process. How is the phrase of Ayela Tashachar Shabaka Oro expressed? The dawn that is exposing its light is breaking through. How is that expressed in the redemption of Israel? The Gemara in Sanhedrin, Tzadi Ches Amud Aleph, the first source that we have cited, brings a statement of Rabbi Abba. Ein lecha ketz megula mizeh shenamar. There is no greater revelation that it is the very, very beginning or pre-beginning of redemption, other than the pasuk from Yecheskel, V'atem Harei Yisrael, and now the mountains of Israel. An peichem titnu, your limbs should give, ufarichem tis'u, and they should raise up fruit, they should hold fruit. La'ami Yisrael, for my people Yisrael, ki arvo lavo, because soon they will come. Rashi explains on the spot, Keshetiten Eretz Yisrael perotaha ba'ayin yafeh, az yikrav haketz, ve'en lecha ketz megula mizeh. When the land of Israel begins to give its fruit in good measure, then the end is drawing near, and there is no sign that the end is drawing near greater than this. The absolute sign that of the end is the expression, the realization of the prophet Yecheskel, that when Israel is going to return to her land, then the land from its own part will begin to give fruit in good measure. The words of Rabbi Abba in the Gemara are very clear. There's no real, it's not one of the phrases in Gemara that can be understood in more than one way. And the Gemara does not quote a single opinion that disagrees with Rabbi Abba. To have an opinion that no one disagrees with in the Gemara is a relatively rare occurrence. However, you can still ask a question. Where did Rabbi Abba get? What's the source of his opinion? Why is this the greatest sign? Why is the fruitfulness of the land the sign that with which we can say that this is the beginning of the redemption? The Marsha, in his commentary on the Gemara there, says, Lefi shekol zman she'ein Yisrael al admatam, this is source 3, as long as Israel is not on their land, ein haaretz notenet perotaha kedarka, the land will not give its fruit in its normal way. Aval kashetachzor litain perotaha, but when it returns to give its fruit, zeyu ketz megula, this is the revelation that the end is coming close. In order to understand the words of the Marsha and the words of Rabbi Abba, perhaps even the words of the Navi Yecheskel, we have to remember some things that were said in the Torah, in Parshat Bechukotai, the rebuke, the end of Vayikra, chapter 26. The Torah says explicitly all the evil things, the disasters that are going to come, God forbid, to Israel, if they do not listen, and if they do not fulfill the Torah and the mitzvot. Among the things that occurs is chapter 26, verse 32. V'hashimoti ani et haaretz, and I will make the land desolate. V'shamamu aleha oivechem hayoshrim ba, and your enemies that live upon it will be desolate. The initial glance at this, we're talking about two punishments. The land will be desolate, and those that living on it will be desolate. But Rashi explains in the name of the Sifra, he opens our eyes to a new understanding of this pasuk. V'hashimoti et ani et haaretz, and I will make the land desolate. Zu mida tova l'Yisrael. This is a good sign for Yisrael. Shelo yimtza'u ha'oivim nachat ruach ba'artzam. The enemies will not find relaxation, contentment in their land. Shetieh shomamam yoshveha. It will be desolate of its inhabitants. What appears initially to be a curse is in fact a blessing. That means as long as we do not, as long as Israel does not live in her land, in our land, also our enemies cannot live there. The source of Rashi is the Sifra in Bechukotai, there, Yud 1, 10, 1. And it appears that a short time after the destruction of the temple, the rabbis already saw that our enemies weren't finding the land so nice to live in as it had been, and it was becoming more and more desolate. Meaning the Sifra was written around the year between the year 200 and 300. So you're talking between 150 and 130 and 230 years after the destruction of the temple. And at that time already, it was clear to them that the land was becoming desolate. Not only Jews were being driven out of the land, but the Romans that were taking over were, relatively soon after they took over a place, were abandoning it. The population was not nearly as high as it had been previously, and it was dropping in number. The Ramban, who lived more than 1,000 years after the destruction of the temple, about 1,150 years after the destruction of the temple, he himself made Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael from Spain after he was forced to have a debate with a Christian clergyman who had previously been Jewish and converted to Catholicism. The Ramban was forced to debate with him, and a year or so after the debate, the Catholic Church published a very short summary of the debate in which it seemed that the Ramban was not able to defend his position. The Ramban then released a transcript of the debate. And because of this transcript, he was forced to flee Spain, and he went to Eretz Yisrael. He himself saw the desolation of the land when he arrived. And this is what he writes in his commentary. The Ramban writes in source 6, in his commentary to the verse in Leviticus 26:32. Masha Amar Bekan. What the verse is saying here, V'shamamu aleha oivechem, that the land will be desolate for your enemies. Hi b'sura tova. This is a good message. V'veseret b'kol guluyot, that we are given this in all of our exiles. Shein artzo mekabelet et oivenu, that our land, ein artzeinu should be, that our land will not accept our enemies. They will be driven out from the land. The gam zu raya gedola v'havtacha lanu, and this is also a great source of argument and a guarantee to us. Ki lo timtza b'chol hayishuv aretz asher hi tova urachava, that no one will find the land that is so good and wide and outstretched. Ve'asher hayta no shevet me'olam v'hi harva kamoha, that was in ancient history inhabited, and it becomes completely desolate like this. V'kulam mishtadlim lahoshiva ve'ein le'el yadam, and all sorts of people try to settle in the land, and they're incapable of doing it. Right? He's saying it's not through lack of trying to settle the land that it's desolate. It's even though different people have tried, nonetheless the land remains desolate. The Ramban lived between some of the Crusades. And when he arrived in Yerushalayim, it was controlled by Muslims. It had previously been controlled by Christians. And there were other areas in the land of Israel that were under Christian control. Huge numbers of Christians made pilgrimages and immigrated to them. But nonetheless, the land wasn't becoming more populated. Arabs came to fight off the Christians, but they didn't tend to stay there. They would fight wars and soon after leave. So the Ramban is looking at this land that at one point was part of the breadbasket of the Middle East that's essentially non-productive, very, very low population, and saying that we don't find, as we travel through the world, which he traveled through a significant portion of the ancient world on his way to Eretz Yisrael, we don't find any place else that was at one point very productive and has become abandoned. One has to pay careful attention to the way the Ramban phrases this. That our land does not accept our enemies. The Ramban is relating to the land of Israel as if it has a personality and it can make its own decisions. Who will live upon it and who will not. Who it will greet nicely and who it will not. The land of Israel doesn't have to accept her guests with a good countenance just because they can enter it. It will not necessarily respond in a positive way, and not everyone will be able to benefit from her fruits. The Ramban wrote a tefillah on the destruction of Israel. This is source 7. It's found in Kitvei HaRamban, first volume. Ve'im kol zeh, and with all of this, masu kach ogvim, masu becha ogvim, those that love you have found you disgusting, talking about the Jews. V'shamamu aleha oivim, and it has been desolate for your enemies. Hamerchakim iskarucha, those that are far away will remember you. V'itparu be'ir hakadosha, and they will make grand the holy city, lemor, to say, Lanu natna lemorasha, was given to us as inheritance. V'kasher yavo elecha matzu kol machmadei ayin, and when they will come to you and find all the beloved things of their eyes, yivarchu kipnei oyev v'rodef ayin, they will flee from the enemy and there will be no one pursuing them. V'devar ha'azuvah b'kerev ha'aretz meina v'harachava, and the thing that was abandoned in the midst of the land, the fat and broad land. Kihem einam hagunim lecha, because they are not fit for you. V'gam et eincha ruyim lehem, and you are not proper for them. Ir Tehillah, a city of praise. Tachat hiyotcha gila ve'amcha mesos b'tchila, in the place where you were rejoicing, and your people were happy in it. Re'iti hayom yoshveha nenachim v'ne'anakim. I have seen today its inhabitants are sighing and travailing under their burdens. Vehemet nimakim, and they're being crushed. L'malot devar Hashem asher diber, to fulfill the word of God that He spoke. Vashimoti ani et haaretz, I will make the land desolate. V'shamamu aleha oivechem, and your enemies will be desolate upon it. Hayoshvim ba, that live in it. Eretz Yisrael is not a place. It's not the only place in the globe that has been destroyed in the course of the history of thousands of generations. But it is a place that seems to be unique. I know of no other, where the people that conquered it weren't really able to dwell in it, weren't able to develop it. And you can't say that they didn't want to dwell in it, because as the Ramban says, "V'kulam mishtadlim lahoshiba ve'ein la'el yadam," all of them attempted to dwell in it, to develop the land and so on, but they weren't capable of doing it. It's very interesting, by the way, even today, when you drive through Yehuda and Shomron, and there are fields right next to each other, some of which are very productive, and some of which are completely and totally empty. I shouldn't say empty, but brown and so on. And you know which are the Jewish fields and which are the Arab fields, by which fields are green and which fields are not. Eretz Yisrael seemingly selects, and they often attempt to do the exact same types of drip irrigation and so on and so forth, but it just doesn't seem to work. Yetera mizu, more than this. In the time when Israel stood in its desolation, new places of the world were inhabited. The North and South America that had very small populations before they were discovered and developed by Europe. Australia, which had a very small population, still has a relatively small population, but not nearly as small as it did when it was only Aborigines. And it's when all of that colonization was going on, all of that development was going on, and there were desires and various groups sent by various Western powers to try and develop different things in Eretz Yisrael, nothing worked. Right? It was just a land of desolation. Rabbeinu Bechaye, who was a student of the Ramban, that wrote his commentary on Chumash 700 years ago, he develops this idea also, and he adds one more interesting point. She'af hayoshvim ba yinhagu shomama alaha, even those that will dwell in it after the destruction, they will have desolation there. Shelo yivnu aleha choma umigdal, they will not build on it a wall and a tower. V'kol ha'omot yishtadlu livnota, all the nations will attempt to build it. Ve'ein lehem koach, and they will not have the power to do so. Yesh ze siman gadol Yisrael, and this is a great sign to Yisrael. Yom shecharba lo kibla umah l'lashon. From the day it was destroyed, the land refused to accept a nation or a language. V'lo tikabel ad sheyashuv efrocheha l'tocha, and she will not accept anyone until her chicks return to her. The Rabbeinu Yonah is painting a picture that the land waits for her children to return to her. We understand that birds return to the nest year after year. They return to the same place. But have we ever heard of a nest that remains faithful to her birds? Eretz Yisrael here, the land of Israel here, is compared to a nest that is faithful to its chicks. There's one other thing that I wanted, it's very important to say here, that the expression that Rabbeinu Bechaye used for the desolate land of Israel, for desolate Zion, Shelo yivnu alaha choma umigdal, that they will not build upon it a wall and a tower. We do not know what Rabbeinu Bechaye intended to say with this expression. But those that are cognizant of the history of the settlement of the land of Israel know that dozens and dozens of settlements were built which were called Choma Umigdal. And they essentially defined what would eventually become the borders of the State of Israel in 1948. During the British Mandate, the British didn't allow construction of settlements as a natural course. If land that was owned by Jews was settled, they would allow it to remain. But also, when Jews settled someplace, they would often be attacked almost immediately by the Arabs, and the British would not defend them. So what the various settlement organizations, the labor Zionists, revisionists, all the Shomer Hatzir, all of them, they all developed the same technique. And that was, you get a few hundred people to go in at night, and they build a watchtower and a fence, a wall, around the area that you're going to develop as the living area, the storage area, the areas you're going to keep all your farm animals and so on. And then once so that would be built overnight. The people that were going to be settling there would move in, and they would defend with their watchtower and their wall, Choma Umigdal. They would defend the settlement. And in that way, settlements were spread out to many places where they previously had not been. This process started about 24, 25, 26, and it continued until the beginning of the Second World War, when it became harder to develop settlements, and because of the Haganah's cooperation with the British, it was no longer necessary to defend settlements in such a way. But until 1939, this was the way settlements developed across the state, and to a large extent, it was those settlements that determined the borders of the land. I'll give you one example. Those of you that look at a map of the Gaza Strip will note that it's narrower the farther north, and there's a specific point where it angles in toward the sea. It becomes less broad. If you look, there's a settlement there, and it was that settlement that was built in this measure, in this way of Choma Umigdal, and that settlement succeeded in staving off the attacks of the Egyptian army, so they had to narrow their line of assault to the north. So that's just one example, but there are many, many more, especially along the Jordanian, what used to be the border with Jordan before 67, where you see the lines go in and out all over the place, and those lines are often going in and out based upon where these settlements that were built literally by a wall and a tower stood. So it's interesting that that Rabbeinu Bachai is talking about that no one was able to build a wall and a tower to develop their land. And now, in living memory of some people, there's some very, very old people still alive, but if not, it's certainly history that's known, very well known in Israel, that the land was defined by these walls and towers. I know of only one of these towers that's still standing. In Kibbutz Merchavia, literally the wide places of God, they have kept the tower to this day. I mean, the wall's no longer there. The kibbutz is much larger than that today. But Kibbutz Merchavia was actually settled 3 times. First 2 times it disbanded. What might be of somewhat minor interest to people is the kibbutz that Golda Meir and her husband were members of for a period of time. But then they couldn't stand, her husband couldn't stand kibbutz life. She loved it, and they left. But that was the kibbutz that they were a member of. Therefore, continuing, we have in our hands knowledge from the generation of destruction, from the Sifra that Rashi mentioned, that was what was the reality in the land. And 1,000 years after the Chorban, after the destruction, the Ramban remembers that was the reality in his time. Rabbeinu Bachai adds to this, that this continues until we will return to the land. And we, 700 years after Rabbeinu Bachai wrote these things, can testify that this is exactly what happened. Until we returned to the land was desolate. And everything that was associated with this, the diseases, and it's interesting, you have swamps in the middle of a desert. You think of opposites, right? Swamps have tons of water, and deserts have no water. And you have the two existing right next to each other, and the malaria from the swamps made it very difficult for people to live in the deserts. There are many very interesting studies, like Ein Harod, people have studied a lot, that the Arab population in the valley of Ein Harod never exceeded 150 people, almost all children. Some people say as much as 90%, although that seems extreme, died of malaria. And when the Jews bought the valley and drained it, and within 2 years ended the malaria in the valley, then the Arab population expanded. When the original settlers came to Petach Tikva to settle it, they brought a doctor to test and see, tell them whether this is an appropriate place to grow or not. The full story is found in Avram Ya'ari's volume on Zichronot Eretz Yisrael, Remembrances of the Land of Israel, the first volume, chapter 26. He was alive at this time in the 1880s, 1882, when Petach Tikva was first settled. It was bought from the land was bought from an absentee owner who lived in Damascus, and they were able to buy a big stretch of land that contains all of Petach Tikva and a lot of what surrounds it today. So the doctor came, and he established, there is death in this place. There is no possibility of live things existing here. And he explained, I do not see in this entire area any mention of life. Not animals, not birds, not even a fly. The fact that even flies aren't here is a sign that life is not possible here. That was the reality then. And we see today that it's completely different, as Petach Tikva is a significant city in Israel. At least in Israel it's considered a city. Maybe 100,000 people. Other places it might not be considered a city, but it's a significant place. A good expression of these things was given by one of the early settlers of Petach Tikva, Rabbi Yoel Moshe Solomon. He writes as follows: who is blind that prevents his eyes from seeing? Or who is so brutal that he hardens his heart to say that God did not do all of these things? Do our eyes not see that this land, in all of its days that have passed before, from the day that her children left her, it has been covered with sackcloth, it has gone down in crying, her beauty has been covered up, it has been hidden by fog. She has not removed the garments of her widowhood. The cloak of her mourning she has not changed. She has not cleaned her face. She hasn't put makeup on her eyes. She has not given her strength to strangers and her produce to non-Jews. The Gorel Baneha, the lot of her children, the ones that were scattered among the nations, that have not rested, have not found a place to rest. This was also her lot, right? Even the land didn't find rest, didn't find pleasantness. One thing God spoke, and two things I heard. V'shamamu aleha oivechem, and it will be desolate for your enemies. V'goyim hahem lo targia, and for those nations they will not find the rest. Ad ki be'et hechalus seride beneha lachonei nofra, until the remnant of her children began to find favor in her dirt. Matzua chareva shemomima, they found her destroyed and desolate. Kiyom azvuha avotenu, like the day that our forefathers abandoned her. Sia va'afel kisu paneha, excrement and dust covered her face. Shama v'shia al kol haraha, desolation and quietness on all of her mountains. Sidei chamodoteha azuvot, her beloved fields are abandoned. The karmei gafeha zenuchot, and her vineyards are left ownerless. V'shmonat asar me'ot shana shikiluha, and for 1,800 years she has been childless. Lo hitzira koach la'ativ matzeva ulivnot harisoteha. She did not strengthen herself to improve her situation or to build up her ruins. Only when her children began to come to her gates, lishkon chaderaha, to dwell in her rooms. Ha'ach, my brother, Tirena einenu yafeino, look out with our eyes and see the beautiful landscape. Mesos chamdateno, that which rejoices with our great love. La'at la'at, little by little. Tasir tzeif alamuta, she removes the veil of her widowhood. Tachlif shad lahanik uraha, she uncovers her breasts to nurse her cubs. Titnar ma'afar shimumoteha, she wakes up, stands up, shakes off the dust of her desolation. V'tita'ef b'simlat klulot, and she enrobes herself, covers herself in a wedding dress. Another expression of the desolation of the land before Israel returned, we can find in the writings of a well-known author named Mark Twain, somewhat familiar to the American audience, in his book Innocents Abroad. Mark Twain, in the 1860s, went abroad. He was looking for material to write about, and as such, he traveled through many places, not only Palestine, but he traveled through many places. And in his chapter on Palestine, I have taken some quotes. A desolate country whose soil is rich enough, but is given over wholly to weeds, a silent, mournful expanse, a desolation. We never saw a human being on the whole route, hardly a tree or shrub anywhere. Even the olive tree and the cactus, those fast friends of worthless soil, had almost deserted the country. A fast walker could go outside the walls of Jerusalem and walk entirely around the city in an hour. I do not know how else to make one understand how small it is. And, by the way, most of Jerusalem at that time was, in fact, not populated. Meaning, when you look at old maps from the Turkish period, the old city of Jerusalem was not completely inhabited. Large sections of it were abandoned and just covered in rubble, and got built up later as the Zionist enterprise grew. More and more people were moving into the city and developing it. But the fact is that the city was essentially had very few inhabitants in it. Just before the First World War, I think it had under 25,000 people living in it. There are over 100,000 people living in the old city today. Um, 10 years after Petach Tikva was established in about 1892, John Foster Dawson wrote, I was not able to find the original English, so we have a Hebrew translation that I will then translate back into English. Ad hayom hazeh lo hitzlicha shum umma hitbaseis k'umma be'eretz Yisrael. Until this day, no nation has been able to establish itself as a nation in the land of Israel. Shum achdut le'umit, no national entity. Shum ruach le'umit, no spiritual, no nation. Lo kanu lehem achizat sham, was able to acquire something there. Oto erev rav shel shvatim dudalim sheyashvu ba hichziku ba rak ka'arisim stam. This mixed multitude of tribes that lived there were clung onto it like tenant farmers, kabali ma'ara'im, like temporary owners. Shekafi hanirei ba'alil, someone can see clearly, hem mahakim le'elu hazakayim lebalu keva al ha'adama. They are waiting for the people that have the true rights to the land to return. How different is this, right? These expressions of the non-Jews to the land of Israel concerning its true owners that will return to it. He stresses the fact that no nation has been able to come and acquire it. He refers to them as scattered tribes, Bedouin, nomads. Exactly the same. He's describing the land exactly the same way as our rabbis did 700, 900, 2,000 years ago. And the Rabbeinu Bachai wrote a similar thing in his commentary to Bereshit, Genesis 17:24. Parshat Lech Lecha, V'natati lecha l'zarecha acharecha et eretz mehurecha, and I will give to you and your descendants after you the land of that you live in. Et kol eretz Canaan lehuzat olam, the entire land of Canaan as an eternal inheritance. Be'er shetiyeh ha'aretz liYisrael achuzat olam shelo yershuha v'shelo yoshivuha rak hem. The entire land of Israel was given to them that no one else would inherit it, no one else would be able to live in it, only them. Ve'im ulai yiglu mimeno, and if they will perhaps be exiled from it, yeshuvu alecha, they will return to it. Ki achuzat olam hi lehem, because it is an eternal inheritance for them. Lo le'umot olam, not for the nations of the world. V'zehu siman gadol Yisrael, and this is the great sign to Israel, shemiyom shegalu mimeno, from the time that they were exiled from it. Lo nityashva sham uma klal, no nation was ever able to live there. Aval hi charba ushmema, but it was destroyed and desolate. Ad sheyashuvu efrocheha letocha, until her chicks, her baby birds, return to it. And we have been able to see, I mean, in the last few generations, anyone that even looks briefly at the history of the land of Israel in the last few generations has seen that this has been completely and totally fulfilled in this way. That is the end of the first of two sections of the second chapter of the book. The second chapter is shorter than the first chapter. Next week is Purim, and I'm flying, it's Shushan Purim, and I'm flying. So we will not have a class next week. The week after that, we will finish the second chapter, do a summary of the second chapter, and start the third chapter.